And he was like, well, Sam Smith. And I was like, oh, here we go.
Welcome back to Impolite Company. In part one of this episode, we'll be talking about the gender binary and how it affects us all, and our responsibility as queer people to be allies. Before we start, we wanted to let you know about a few changes we've made to the podcast. Episodes are now about 30 minutes long, and this means that episodes such as this one will be spread across more than 2 parts. Hopefully this makes it perfect for your commute and easy to jump in and out of the conversation. Anyway, let's get into the episode, but do let us know if this new format works for you.
Okay, so today we're going to get straight into it, and we're going to talk about gender, which is a pretty enormous topic to try and cover. And if you've listened to the first episodes of this, you'll know that Kieran and I have a tendency to talk a lot. So, and this is a big topic, but we really wanted to talk about it partly because I think we both think of ourselves as trans allies.
For sure.
And there's an absolutely disgraceful climate at the moment around trans people's rights. And also, I think we wanted to talk about gender from the perspective of people who, I suppose, exist outside of heteronormativity.
Yeah.
And what that means to us, and how does gender impact us personally, as well as how do we want to think about it in solidarity with trans people. And then also kind of talk about, well, what about gender in the workplace, and how are companies currently thinking about this issue at the moment, and what are they doing or not doing in trying to build gender inclusive workplaces? Because it occurs to me, as somebody who's working with companies at the moment on their DEI, that gender feels like the kind of last taboo almost, that companies are willing to talk about LGBTQ plus inclusion in theory, but what they really are talking about is LGB inclusion.
Yeah.
And so we're going to talk about all of the above. I think we should start by chatting a little bit about the gender binary as a kind of social structure, and so that we can get into some clear definitions of what we're really talking about here. I mean, Kieran, do you have a view on the gender binary? Do you have an understanding, you think, of what it is?
Yeah, I think I probably have a view of it, which is, like you said, in kind of, I look at these things in a very, I think in a way that I think a lot of people may see it that way, but I think some of it really boils down and is quite simple for me in terms of, one, the difference between sex and gender is a really important thing to understand, and understand the differences there about like the biology element of it and the psychological element of it, and understand how that works. I think it's really important. I think also what I've learned over time is to really, the only way you can understand is to listen, and not be judgmental, and be able to separate maybe the things that you society has pre-exposed you to understand and not understand, and things that you just need to learn. Like, we always need to be learning. We're not, and also understanding how things get oversimplified. And I think it's quite easy when you do sit in multiple intersections to be able to comprehend that kind of stuff that might be very complex. So in terms of my view is an inclusive view where I listen, and where for me it's never about someone trying to take something from someone else with the idea that they're losing something by that person being identified as who they are. And I think for me that's a really important thing. I don't push any of my thoughts. I may have an opinion on things, but I think it's really important to always be open to those opinions being changed. And I think I've definitely I've never by any stretch of the imagination been anti-trans at all. But I think I have been, when I was younger, ignorant, just because I didn't have exposure and didn't have a good understanding of what things meant, and also things being trivialized. And that's, for me, that's been a journey for me to really speak to people that are trans or they don't fit into the gender norms that people are used to, and to understand it. For me specifically, around people that identify as non-binary, that's been probably, I think, everything else I've been able to comprehend, and now I can comprehend what non-binary means. But I think at first, because it wasn't something that I was ever exposed to as a classification or or it being part of the constructs that we're used to. It was something that I had to do a lot of like internal discussion and speaking to people that were non-binary to understand. And I do think shows such as like RuPaul's Drag Race have helped with some of those conversations where I definitely didn't understand what non-binary meant, and now I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
but it speaks to that thing of that I think is part of almost what gets termed as the trans debate, which I kind of hate the terminology of that in the first place, because it indicates or it implies that there is any kind of debate about trans existence or about trans people, like their existence should be debated, or we have a right to debate it. But what often gets talked about in that context is, you know, I'm kind of simplifying, but, you know, almost this kind of idea that these are newfangled identities that we never had before. And like, why have I got to learn all this terminology? And like, isn't this ridiculous? And my view on this, or my, I suppose, learning journey, like you've been on with this, is my kind of university background was history. And so I'm very interested in history. And I think if we go, the more I've learned and kind of delved into the history of some of this stuff, the more you realize that this isn't new.
No.
And I think, to your point, we understand that transness isn't new, but I think this kind of gender non-conforming identity, some people see as new. And the more you don't really have to scratch the surface very much, right? Like, you don't have to look very far. You can Google this stuff and find out pretty easily that societies, dozens of societies all around the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years, you know, in India, thousands of years, have had, you know, multiple gender identities recognized. And actually it was colonialism, which is like, unfortunately, the answer to a lot of things. It was colonialism that actually imposed this concept of the gender binary on those societies, and we're all living with the legacy of some of those teachings, including in the UK, but in Commonwealth countries, and basically any country that was colonized by a Western European country over the past 300 years.
Yeah, I think that's the sad thing, right? It's and the thing that's so, I find very frustrating, especially when you look at like the exactly what you've talked about, where it originally comes from, that some of these thought processes come from countries that have that the UK or that Britain have touched, part of the imperial takeover of the world. Some of the views didn't develop in some of those countries, and then it feels really sad that those countries are then looked at as backwards when that initial narrative and the trajectory was planted by imperialism.
Yes, it's a colonial legacy.
It's a colonial legacy.
That you've got homophobia and transphobia in a lot of societies. You know, in Native American societies, there are two-spirit traditions of two-spirit individuals and in a lot of these ancient societies, without getting into kind of too much of a history lesson, not only were genders other than, you know, male, female recognized, but revered. I think that's a really important thing to say, right? Like in a lot of African countries, in India, in Native American tribes, you know, people who were gender non-conforming in any way, which includes people we would define as trans, who they might not have been defined in those terms per se, but people we would define as trans, but also includes queer people, right? Like masculine presenting women, feminine presenting men were seen and were able to cohabit with people of the same sex, and were seen as holy in some senses, sacred in some senses. And so it is a real tragedy that we're now in a place where we've got these colonial legacies in some of those societies. When really, to your point, like in terms of how we would think about progressive thinking, they were way, way, way ahead. Hundreds, if not thousands of years ago.
I remember watching something about, I can't remember what part of the Native American culture, but they were talking about the two-spirited people. And they were saying that those individuals were key to society, and they were seen as the link between male and female, and they played a very specific role in help balance femininity and masculinity. It's like when you hear about things being spoken in that way, it's such a different level of intelligence, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what that speaks also beautifully to, in a way, is this sense of interconnectedness of trans identity and queer identities in general, because in one form or another, we're all existing outside of the heteronormative gender binary. And I suppose the way I'm thinking about that, the way I'm defining that as, is there's man and there's woman, there's male and there's female, there's masculine and there's feminine, and there are roles associated with those identities, and there are attributes associated with those, you know, and that they cannot meet, right? They cannot overlap. You know, the feminine traits cannot be experienced by men, and vice versa. And anyone who exists outside of those norms is othered and is not welcome, and all of that kind of stuff. But I would kind of argue that we all, in some form, exist outside of those really binary categories. But kind of, I'm interested in what you think about as people who both identify as queer, what you think our responsibility is as from within the community to be trans allies.
Our responsibility is to know better, and is not to feed in to those kind of dangerous narratives and rhetoric, and be allies, right? I think sometimes people forget that. I think sometimes when you, especially if you've not been close to the struggles of a group that you're now a part of, or you have any understanding of that, I think a lot of people find it hard to draw the similarities. So, for example, my mum's mixed race, my dad is black. I've grown up knowing what happened in Windrush. I've grown up understanding the lives that my nan, as a white woman being married to a black man, what they had to put up with, and what ignorance looks like, and how it rears its ugly head, and how it can really challenge and destroy parts of a family, or parts of society. So I think using our own lived experiences and digging deep and trying to draw those lines between where there's similarities is really important for us to do, as people that may not be completely aligned but have similar lived experiences. And I don't want that to happen again, right? I don't want those things to play out again and continue to play out in other marginalized parts of society, and it shouldn't. So I think, you know, as queer people, the things that we can be doing is we are in a really great position to be able to identify when these things are playing out. And it's not about being, you know, the savior, but being supportive and being compassionate, and also, in terms of being an ally, speaking up when we need to speak up with the privilege that we may have, whether that's privilege of knowledge or privilege in an environment that you're in. So if you're in a more senior position, like I am in my roles, helping educate, like, how do I speak to my colleagues and peers that don't quite understand what's going on? How do I educate them in those areas? How do I pull them up on some of that behavior in a way that's not confrontational or makes them feel like they're not good at their job, or that they, you know, they're not woke enough, or that kind of like narrative that goes with not just learning your mistakes. So that's kind of where I see it. I think it's about just, I'm more so than ever just really aware of things. Any person that's a marginalized part of any group, whether it's in work or outside, I'm just much more aware of it, and I think about the damage it can do if unchecked, if certain behaviors are unchecked.
But do you also think that, I think there's something to be said for the fact that, and I think it's much better now.
Yeah.
maybe I can't speak to this too much from a personal perspective because I've only been queer in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But you know, if you look into some of the history of the gay rights movement, for instance, there's quite a lot of transphobia within the
True.
movement, right? And like
Racism
too, right? I think there's something about the fact that it's so great that the LGBTQ plus community is such a broad church of so many diverse experiences. And then within that, you then get this kind of hierarchy of privilege as well.
Yeah.
And also, you know, if you think about like the 60s, 70s to, I don't know, the 90s, 2000s, it seems like basically the main aims of the kind of mainstream gay rights movement were like assimilation into mainstream culture. Like we want marriage equality, and we want the right to have 2.5 kids and a picket fence as well. And so this desire to kind of, I don't know, I'm kind of interested in this desire even within the queer community historically to like assimilate, and therefore naturally you have trans people almost being perceived sometimes as like you're letting the side down because we're trying to assimilate here.
Yeah.
You know, we're trying and that
unless
prioritize.
You're passing.
Yeah, unless you're really unless you're passing.
Yeah.
And that also lends itself to racism, you know, and to kind of almost like a whitewashing of the diversity of the community as a whole.
Yeah. And like and toxic masculinity in the male gay community. And we've seen that play out as well. And these are the things, like you see these things play out. So this kind of exclusionary and counterproductive to our own cause as a group, right? We then start to, like you said, assimilate some of the same bigotry that was that everyone's fighting against. And that's what's really like, why does that happen? And also we know who always ends up at the top of that. At the top of that, especially when it comes to like white men, we saw that, right? And I think I was quite lucky because my mum used to work with young, predominantly gay, LGBT men who sold themselves when between the age of 16 and 25. And one of the things
as in prostitutes,
yeah. So they were sex workers, and I remember I remember speaking to my mum about when I came out, but not necessarily just when I came out. I remember her always talking about, and she's always had lots of gay friends, and there's always been gay people around me growing up. And I specifically gay men, actually, there was quite a few gay men around when I was younger, friends of my mum. And I always remember her saying to me like that, because she was so in the scene with her work, because she worked for a charity which got acquired by the Terence Higgins Trust, but they were called Streetwise or SW5. One of the things that she told me when I came out was that the gay world is so racist.
Oh, was that one of the first things she said?
That was the only thing, one of the only things she worried about, because she said it's so, from what she's seen.
Wow.
Especially working kind of on the front line with a lot of
men. She can speak to that from experience. She's not just
and she would do outreach, and she would like some, you know, there's some places that until the like late 90s would be funny on the door with black gay men or black lesbians, or, you know, and it's like, for me, for her that was the biggest worry that she had. It wasn't that I was gay.
Interesting.
It was that the things she was like, the things you're going to have to come up against. Obviously she was basing that on, you know, the previous 15 years that she'd been deeply in that, which would have been like early 90s to early 2000s. But it's really interesting. And when you look at things as recent as, I think maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, the fact that on apps such as Grindr, people could specify whether, you know, they don't, and it was okay to say like no Chinese, no blacks, no, that's not acceptable.
Like, that's just my preference.
What are you talking about? Yeah, that's my preference. It's like
my preference is that I don't like brown skin. So
okay, let's apply it to everything then, right? Let's see how you would feel if it was like, I don't like gays. I'm sure you would have an opinion on that, right? But those same people want to do that to other people. It's like, what is going on? You can't, that's not acceptable. And it's counterproductive collectively to getting society where you want it to be, unless you've got your privilege now and you're happy with it, you know?
Well, I think that might be part of it. I think if you take an assimilationist approach,
Yeah.
then that comes with
Yeah.
potential racism, potential transphobia, potential rejection of anything that exists outside of. It's almost like a heteronormative approach to being
Yeah.
gay, and I think that queer liberation looks different than that.
Yeah.
I think it looks like the full diversity of the queer community being embraced and
Yeah.
accepted
Exactly.
and having rights.
Yeah.
Right. But like, I think sometimes in the push for rights, there's been a desire to kind of say, well, we're as close to the
Prioritize.
ideal
Yeah.
of white heterosexual society as possible, and therefore we want the privileges of being close to that,
Yeah.
close to the top of the pyramid. And who's close to the top of the pyramid? Well, predominantly white gay men. You know, that you're really at the top of the tree there.
If you're straight passing.
Yeah, straight
it's
passing like, white gay men.
Yeah.
You know, Tim Cook.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good example.
It's
really good example.
Is the ideal.
Yeah. Yeah. To the point where it's like hardly even spoken about, because people equate so much value to all the other things because they just don't even see it. You know, it's not in their face. It's palatable.
And let's talk about this thing of like in your face, because I had a conversation recently, and I won't get into all of the detail of the conversation because it was a kind of wide ranging, but basically it was a transphobic. He was saying a lot of transphobic stuff on this call to me without really realizing he was, you know, without consciousness around it. And one of the things he said kind of fairly abruptly was like, "Did you watch the Brits recently?" And I was like, "No."
Yeah.
And he was like, "Well, Sam Smith." And I was like, "Oh, here we go."
I've had similar conversations.
What you gonna say? And it, you know, there's something. Well, we all know it's not something. We know what it is, but Sam Smith is like almost at the forefront of this for people. Like they cannot handle their presentation and that terminology, that kind of phrasing of, "It's just in your face, isn't it?" He said to the guy on the call said to me, "Well, I'm straight, but I don't I don't rub it in everyone's face." And I was like,
where do I start?
You do. You do. And so the interesting thing, you know, what I think is often behind that kind of comment is this lack of understanding from straight people in particular, that their straightness is in everyone's face. Their straightness is, but there's a kind of, what happens, I think, often with people who are from, you know, dominant groups in UK society, let's say, is they see their identity as invisible almost. It's like the norm against which we judge things. So me wearing a suit and talking about my wife all day long is seen as almost kind of an invisible thing. But if a person was wearing a different type of clothing every day, which wasn't obviously coded as masculine or feminine, and we're talking about their same-sex partner, that gets viewed as rubbing it in your face. So there's this kind of like invisible norm against which we judge the Sam Smiths of the world.
But also, who do you think you are to think that someone's doing that for you?
To piss you off.
This is what annoys me. It's like, who do you think you are to think that this person is going out of their way to do something that it doesn't come naturally or make them feel like who they are for you? Who made you think that? Or what made you think that?
I think it's a lack of understanding that what, in this example, Sam Smith is doing is dressing and expressing themselves and creatively being themselves. It's a view that they're doing that. They're not just doing that. That's not natural. They're doing that to show off in some way. So if they were just being normal, they'd be wearing a suit like me. And so everything outside of that is showing off. There's not an understanding that that expression might be how I feel my deepest sense of comfort.
Yeah.
It's not about being exhibitionist to piss you off or to push people's buttons necessarily. You know, I understand that with artists in general, sometimes they are doing things to make a point or whatever. But I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding from straight people, but also this sometimes happens within the queer community from people who are more traditionally, masculine or feminine presenting, that, oh, for God's sake.
Self-hatred.
Thanks for listening, and join us next week for the next part of this episode.